Everyone has a worldview, an understanding of what is real, whether they've ever thought about it much or not. And basically, there are two primary worldviews. Firstly, there is the dominant non-religious worldview, which is often referred to as the secular or modern worldview. And this understanding confines itself to the visible world of our ordinary and everyday experience as disclosed by signs. And secondly, there is the religious worldview. And here there is the conviction that in addition to the visible world of our ordinary experience, as disclosed by signs, there is an extra dimension of reality, a non-material layer, something more. Now, this extra dimension has been named in various ways: God, Spirit, the sacred, Yahweh, the Teo, Allah, Brahman, Atman, by the various major religions in the world. The word God is a term familiar to us, but what does the concept God actually mean for each one of us this morning? Well, growing up, God for me was supernaturalist and interventionist out there, who had created the universe a long time ago and who now watched over it, and who occasionally intervened in the world, especially in the events reported in the Bible. Also, God was a God of requirements, who demanded that a number of minimum requirements be met now for the sake of eternal rewards or being saved later. A good number of years ago, back in Scotland, I attended a little primary school in a place called Lenzie. It was just outside of Glasgow, and it was a Victorian building, and the windows were set high so that the children didn't look out, they could focus on their lessons. And one year we got a new teacher, and this new teacher had some wonderful new ideas. She put a chart at the back of the classroom, and the idea was that if you were good at your lessons, you got a gold star. So on the chart, she had everyone's name in the class, a column next to it for the gold stars. Now, I was quite good back then. I was quite good at reading, I was good at writing, I was good at arithmetic, I was good at memorizing things, and so I accumulated quite a number of gold stars in that first column. However, she had a second column as well. And in this second column, you received red stars. And these red stars were when you did not behave in class. And I accumulated quite a number of red stars, as I was rather fond of talking. Now, at the end of the month, we had to add up the number of gold stars, add up the number of red stars, and subtract one from the other. And at the end of each month, those who had the highest score received a reward, and those who had lower scores had a bit of a talking to. And that's basically how we understood life at that time. And that's also how we understood God at that time. That's what we were taught in Sunday school. And many of you here this morning might also have experienced this type of image and understanding of God whilst growing up, to do with requirements and rewards. And this inherited and still quite widespread image has nourished many, many people over the centuries and still works for a number of people today. But for others, its vision has been alienating and no longer compelling. For them, a God described in pre-scientific worldviews can only be believed in by suspending their intelligence and leaving their minds at the door of the church. Whilst remaining within the church, perhaps some of you now find yourself struggling to interpret Christian faith and experience and a concept of God which has some integrity in the 21st century. Perhaps, for intellectual reasons, you've found that the form of Christianity learned in your childhood has long ceased to be persuasive, and that you can no longer believe in many of the traditional concepts, language and attitudes, because they seem to be in such conflict with the world in which you live. And likewise, while continuing to love many of the old hymns which you have sung over the years, you now find that the words of those hymns are no longer meaningful or helpful. If we wish to affirm the wisdom contained in Bible stories, shaped in a worldview quite different from ours, and ensure that those insights continue to be heard today, then any concept of God and statements of religious faith must be compatible with today's view of the world. If not, they will soon be deemed irrelevant. As you know, before the 17th century, most people thought that the universe was relatively small. The Earth was at its centre. The stars and planets were not very far away, and thus to think of God as being up there or up in heaven and separate from the world was totally acceptable. But we've moved on. Today's view of the world is, of course, much different. The world is round, not flat, and very much shaped by scientific data about our universe and the development of life on Earth. And then there are the changes in our own lifetimes. For example, coming to church in a comfortable, heated car rather than walking or using more basic forms of transport, living with central heating rather than wood stoves, as well as space travel and advances in medical science and health. And also, ladies no longer wearing hats in church, and men no longer wearing their best Sunday suits, often smelling of mothballs. In addition, many of us today are now living in large, multicultural cities. All of this, unknown to our ancestors, challenges us to think in a transforming, scientific and culturally inclusive way. And what is needed today is a concept of God which embraces our expanding knowledge and a growing awareness of the impact of misguided understandings of God on individual, social, and political life. You know, over the years, people have used metaphors from their cultures, traditions, and view of the world in an attempt to describe their experience of the mystery of God. And the ancient Hebrews were no exception. They made use of many metaphors which made sense to them in their desert tribal lifestyle: fortress, rock, wind, breath, warrior, king, judge, mother hen. Of course, all of them together could not encompass their limitless God. The problem today is that some of these metaphors have become so cemented in our doctrines and creeds, such as when we talk about God, we're often committed to talk in this ancient, often obsolete imagery. So much so that we tend to devalue or obliterate all other more contemporary and culturally appropriate metaphors. So what would a contemporary concept or image of God be like? How might we think of the being of God and the God-world relationship? Well, I would suggest that rather imagining God as a person-like being out there, might it be helpful to imagine God as the encompassing spirit in whom everything that is exists? In other words, seeing and experiencing the universe as not separate from God, but in God. As Paul says, God is the loving presence in which we live and move and have our being. In other words, God is not out there, but right here, within us and all around us. God is the creative energy at the heart of life in which we all live and dwell. You know, how we imagine the character of God really matters, as it shapes our sense of what faithfulness to God means and what the Christian life is really about. Like previous generations, it's in our very nature to try and make sense of our experiences in the light of current knowledge and new information which is now available to us. And so it's vital to draw in a more contemporary way of thinking of God if the reality and energy of God at the heart of life is to be freshly released into the life of the church and into the world. We need to consider new and liberating images of God as we seek to reflect the miracle of God's love in our lives as revealed in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. We need to acknowledge that love, the love which flows through and around all of life, rather than almighty power, which is the essential element in our understanding. The power of God is the power of love, not the power of a coercive ruler. We need to realize that we are not miserable worms in the hands of a God who is to be feared and whose mercy is to be won, who keeps a record of our shortcomings, and who will reward or punish us accordingly. Rather, we share with God the task and privilege of weaving love and justice into our divided world. How accurate was Charles Wesley when he described God as pure, unbounded love in the hymn, "Love divine, all loves excelling." And because of our human limitations to imagine God, we still need to make use of metaphors and personal human imagery when we talk of God today. But we must make use of metaphors which are relevant and contemporary, and we must be constantly aware of what they are, just metaphors. In the words of Paul, God is the loving presence in which we live and move and have our being. Or as one theologian expressed it, we live in God as a fish lives in water. We live in God as a fish lives in water. This love is around us and within us and between us. I'm not suggesting today that one vision of Christianity is right and the other wrong. Rather, the issue is whether a particular model works for you or gets in the way. If the earlier model works for you, well, there is no reason to change. But for others, might it be a way forward for them of taking Christianity and Christian life seriously?